Okay. So far, mostly last week, because we haven't really done much this week, but we were talking about graphing trig functions. So remember, there's a couple important ideas here. Today we're just going to kind of put it all together. So the first thing you need to know is just like the general shape of the trig functions, right? So if it's a sine function, then it generally looks like this. This is the y-axis. It starts at the midline, goes up, and then goes down, and then comes back to the midline. That's the general shape of the sine. I didn't draw the x-axis in because it might be a vertical shift or whatever, right? If it's negative sine, then it starts at the midline and just does the lower little hump first. It goes like that. Okay? If it's a cosine function, then it starts at its high spot and goes down and then comes back up. And if it's negative cosine, it just does the opposite. It starts at its low point and goes up. That's the first thing you need to know. It's just the general shapes of these trig waves. The second thing you need to know is the ways that they can be transformed, either stretched or shrunk or translated up or down. And for that, you need to just know like the parts of the equation. So if I have y equals a sine bx plus c, or y equals a cosine bx plus c. The a is the amplitude in absolute value. So the absolute value of a is the amplitude. That's how high it goes above the midline. The b is the frequency, which is just how many cycles there are in 2 pi or 360. B frequency. And 2 pi over b, 360 degrees over b, this gives you the period, which is just the number of degrees or radians it takes to do 1 cycle. And then the last part of this is the c. So the c value is the vertical shift. So the midline equation is y equals c, together with its sign. So if it's minus a number, then that means it's just down. Okay? So if you put all that stuff together, I mean, we can graph these functions, no problem. Like if it was something like y equals negative 3 cosine 2x plus 2, something like that. The first thing I would do is I would figure out the midline part of it, because that's kind of like the base of like where this thing's going to go, right, or where it's going to be located. So midline here is y equals 2 right here. Shift it up 2 units, and then I would make sure that I have enough room above and below that to go up 3 and down 3. So up and make sure I can go up 3 and I can go down 3 from that. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is figure out what the general shape of this is. It's a negative cosine, so it's going to look generally like this one. It's going to start at its low spot and then go up and come back down. Okay? So it's going to start down here at -1 because that's 3 below the midline. It's going to go up and come back down, and there's going to be 2 complete cycles in 2 pi. So it's going to start here, go up to its high spot, down, and then repeat it again, if that is 2 pi worth of this graph. And that's all there is to it. So you identify the midline, figure out what the amplitude above and the amplitude below that's going to be, get the general shape of the graph, and then just make sure you have enough cycles in 360 that you're supposed to have. In this case, 2 complete cycles. Does that make sense? Now the homework assignment in Delta Math, there's 2 types of problems. The first type of problem is where they give you the curve, and they want you to figure out what the equation of that curve is. So let me just show you like what that looks like on Delta Math. I think that's the easiest way to figure this out. So this is the assignment for tonight. And you can see there's two types of problems. There's trig graph discovery. Those are problems where they give you the graph and they want you to find the equation. And then there's graphing trig functions. Those are the kind where they give you the equation and they want you to graph it. So let's just try one of these trig graph discoveries. Okay, so if I just click on that, you can see that they're giving you two things. All right, so the first thing they're giving you is this black curve. This black curve is just a normal sine curve. Okay, you can see it starts at 0, goes up to 1, goes down to -1, and back to 0, and it does one cycle in 2 pi. They just want to know, like, how do you have to change that sine curve to get the curve that's dotted lines? So the first thing I recognize is it's kind of like a reflection, right? So whatever it is, it has to be a negative number out front. The second thing you notice is the midline is 1, right? If you look at the high point, which is 5, and the low point, which is -3, halfway in the middle would be 1. So this number here is just going to be a 1. That's the vertical shift. It goes 4 above that and 4 below that, so this must be a -4 because it's a negative sine function. So I'm just going to type in -4. So the only thing left to determine is how many complete cycles there are in 2 pi, and you can see there's just 1, right? If you start here, and it goes down, and then up, and then back to its midline, that's just 1 cycle in 2 pi. So this number is just going to be a 1. But let's say I messed up and I thought this was like a 2. Okay, I could just click try, and it'll like animate it, and you'll see that it's not quite right. There's too many cycles involved, right? So then you can play around with it and change this to 1, try again, and everything looks pretty good. And then you just submit your answer. Okay, the only difference between this section level 2 and the other section level 3 is just the equation. The equation might be a little bit more involved. Like in this case, the original graph again is just a normal cosine, but this time we're stretching it out, and so it's a little bit different. But it's the same idea. Okay. The second type of problem then is the type where they give you the equation and you have to graph it. So again, there's just like varying levels, but they're all kind of the same. So if I click on one of those, you can see they gave me a trig graph here, a function, and they want you to graph it. So the first thing you have to do is it'll tell you what to do. It says set the x and y axis labels. So basically they want to know like what scale do you want to use for your graph. So like if I know that the midline is 4, the amplitude is 2, then I have to have at least it go up to 6, right, on my graph, and at least down to 2, right? So I wouldn't want to set this scale to be like 0.25, because then I wouldn't, if this was 0.25, that means that that's 1, and that's 2, and I would run out of room, right? So I'm just going to set it to be 1. I think in most cases, you probably just set it to be 1, okay? For the x-axis, the thing to realize here is that everything is in radians, right? So the way I'm going to handle the x-axis is I'm going to look at the frequency here, okay? The frequency is 3/2. If the frequency is 3/2, then the period, how do I find the period?
360 divided by.
Right, but it's in radians, so
2 pi.
2 pi divided by frequency. So this is going to be 2 pi divided by 3/2, which is really just 2 pi times 2/3, or 4 pi over 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually label this 4 pi over 3, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm just going to click on this. I'm going to do 4, push the pi button, divided by 3, and then I'm going to click done. So what that does is it completely labels the y-axis, but it just has this point off to the side here. Now I can move it anywhere I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually graph my trig wave, and then I'm just going to place this point where one cycle ends. That way I know it's like an accurate scale. You get what I'm saying? Okay, so it says that you have to plot 5 points for one cycle. Well, there's 5 natural points to plot. Like if it's a sine graph, I want to plot it at the midline, then the high point, then the midline, then the low point, then the midline again. That's 5 points. If it's a cosine, it's the high point, midline, low point, midline, high point, right? Plot those points. Don't try and plot some weird middle points. You'll have a really hard time getting it right if you do that, okay? So don't do that. So in this case, this graph starts on the midline, which is 4. So I'm just going to plot a point at 4. Okay? The next point has to be 2 above that, because that's the amplitude, and it's a normal sine function. It's not a negative sign. So I'm just going to go 2 above that. Now, if I want to, I can go right next to it and plot it right there. Or I could like skip a block and go over there or whatever. I'm just going to go right next to it, 2 above. And then midline again, and then 2 below, and then the midline again. And it plots a little curve for you. Then all I'm going to do is take my 4 pi over 3, and I'm going to make sure that that's on the x-axis right where 1 cycle ends. That's it. And now I'm just going to submit. So if I submit this, it's not going to look exactly like what they had, but it's right. Like if I click on this, and I look at what they have, they actually like skipped blocks. They started at the midline, went up, they skipped like 3 blocks over, like little grid lines, and then did it, and then did it, and then like that. It's the same as what I have. It's just a little bit of a different scale, but it's labeled the same, so you get credit for it. Okay. If I wanted to also, I could have plotted more points, right? I could have plotted more points and just had it labeled at the end of the, like at 2 pi or whatever, something like that. But in a case like that, especially if the frequency is something like 3 halves, it gets a little complicated about where to end it. You know what I mean? So you just have to be careful about that. So my advice is make the x-axis label be the period, draw your curve, and then just place it at the end of 1 cycle. That's the easiest way to get it right. You get what I'm saying? And then again, like if I went to a different level, like level 3 or something, I mean, this function is no more difficult than the one we just did. Generally, sometimes they might make this number be, like in this case, the other one was 3 halves. So I was going to say, in this case, it's greater than 1, but in this case, it's greater than 1, too. So this is like the same level of difficulty, in my opinion. You just do it the same way. I didn't assign very many of these because it's a little time consuming, but that's the process. Any questions? Okay, that's all I got. I'm going to stop recording, even though I probably didn't record.